Corvair. And for the title of this next speaker's presentation, Cybersecurity Unsafe at Any Speed, I thought that was kind of ironic. So our Simon Hartley is with 202 Partners and has, for those who are not aware of him, you can read on the biography, has lived an extremely interesting life in the world of cybersecurity. So I'm thrilled to have him here. He is the second part of our discussion on cybersecurity. And he is to talk about cybersecurity and data privacy regulations and challenging you in the automotive industry to think just a little bit differently about how you look at cybersecurity. So, ladies and gentlemen, Simon Hartley.
Thank you. Hello, Detroit. So, as many in the audience will know, it was 1965 that Ralph Nader put out a book called Cyber Unsafe at Any Speed. And what he was underlining were the hardware issues of the time with safety. So, thanks to Ralph Nader, we have things today like seat belts and airbags and ABS braking. And the industry regulator, as many of you know, is NHTSA. So not too many PowerPoints here. Over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking about really a journey from here, from 1961, and we have that beautiful Chevy Corsair, which was the subject of Ralph Nader's book back in the 60s, to the right-hand side, really a journey from hardware to software, to connectivity, to automation. So it's interesting, that's 1962's version of the future, the Jetsons. So we haven't quite got to the flying car, but if we look at that, we've got George Jetson at the controls, and Rosie the robot is in back, and she's ready to step in, but not quite just yet. So why are we all here? Vehicles are a big deal. In the US alone, we've got 250 million vehicles on the roads. Pretty much we all have one. Very interesting stat in America, especially compared to Europe, is 70% of freight is moved by road. And that leads Homeland Security to consider transportation to be a critical infrastructure. So this is very important stuff, and as you saw in the title, it was very specific. This is cars, trucks, and commercial vehicles, because a lot of times in the press you'll see an accent on cybersecurity for cars, but I think to an extent the kind of forgotten audience is 5% of vehicles on US roads are in fleets. These are police cars. These delivery trucks, these are postal vehicles, and so on. Just in the US government, I come from DC, we got 600,000 vehicles that are managed by the US government, which I thought was a huge number. So just want to emphasize as I'm going through this talk, think this isn't just cars, but it's trucks and commercial vehicles. So what's the big issue? 35,000 fatalities per year. And the first time I saw this figure, I was shocked. 94% of that is due to human error. It's a huge problem. Well, we're engineers, we know how to solve problems. So what's our big solution? It's connectivity, it's driver assistance, the terminology there, ADAS, and it's automation. So what does that buy us? It buys us better safety. Computers, they don't drink and drive. They're not distracted. They're not texting. They drive better than us. It buys us greater efficiency. You've got better routing, better parking, you name it, which leads to cleaner air, which leads to less congestion. Again, another statistic I saw in this area was downtown. It's something like 1/3 of all traffic in a downtown area is just looking for parking. And of course, I'm sure you've seen many speakers on this stage and others. We're all looking to get towards an automated sharing, and kind of smart city future. You know, a new phrase that I've heard popping up the last year or so is that the car is like a smartphone. It's like a smartphone with wheels. I would contend that that doesn't really go far enough. I would say that the car is a data center on wheels. The stats speak for themselves. You've got up to 100 microprocessors, 100 million lines of code. That's 10 times more code than in the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35. And again, a lot of you are familiar with connectivity within consumer cars. 40% of fleets are already online. And Intel told us quite recently that the amount of data generated by connected cars is up to 4 terabytes per vehicle per day. Okay, why is this important? We've been doing cybersecurity for 20, 30 years. You've got big companies, Microsoft, Google, you name them all. Uncle Sam paid for me to have another year of free credit reporting. I'm sure many people in the room have been hit with the Yahoo breach, with the Target breach, the Neiman Marcus breach. It's just becoming a common occurrence. The problem is here, cars used to be air-gapped. It used to be a closed system. Today, cars are connected, and especially on older vehicles, that connection goes right to the CAN bus, or if you're a truck person, the J1939 bus. So what can go wrong? Well, property damage, death, breakdown of critical infrastructure. What if a truck is stopped in a tunnel? What if it's stopped on a freeway entrance? What if someone had a kill switch for a police cruiser? And then data. You're beginning with the elements of kind of a black box, date, time, GPS, speed, and so on, collision data. But depending on your vehicle, and as we move forward, you've got the potential that all audio within the vehicle, video within the vehicle, and if you look at some of the new luxury models, you're talking about 360 degrees of video around the car. That's a lot of data that's being stored and transmitted. Why should we worry? That's a really, really long list. An attack surface is the way that a hacker can get into the vehicle. We've seen some of these, I'm sure you've seen them in the press, everything from your OBD port to your J1939 port to your ECUs. It's just a huge attack surface. A little technical aside, if you think about a CAN bus, in a CAN bus, every ECU can broadcast, but they don't have to say who they are. So if you can get from the telematics to the CAN bus, and you can influence that, or let's say you're a component already introduced into the CAN bus, you have control. Another issue we have, you know, if we go back into the 50s and 60s, you have vertical integration. You know, one company that controls every element. Something that's relatively unusual in automotive is 80% of all those components are from suppliers. That could be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Some of the tier 3s, they didn't even know they're going to be going into cars. Aftermarket, if I think of a big rig, the manufacturer delivers the big rig, but then that telematics system that's introduced, that's aftermarket. Or I'm an insurance company and I want to have a dongle that plugs into the OBD2 port. It has wireless connectivity. That's part of the aftermarket. And the reason I'm talking here about cybersecurity is there's a huge challenge. There's an asymmetry. If I'm an attacker, I need only find one weak link, just one. But if I'm a defender, I have to defend not just the one piece that I control, I have to consider the entire end-to-end that covers that supply chain. In the past, I've heard argued that, hey, this is esoteric knowledge, this is abstruse, there's only a few people in Detroit that know this kind of thing. In 2010, already 7 years ago, the first academic reports of hacking came out, and to general indifference. Some people noticed, but in general, you didn't see articles in Wired, you didn't see articles in the Wall Street Journal. It just passed under notice. By 2014, Craig Smith had put together an interesting book, which some of you may know, called Car Hacker's Handbook. There were 300,000 downloads in just the first 4 days. Now, obviously, these people aren't hackers in the sense of the mass media. These are enthusiasts. These are people who want to work on ECUs and tune them. Or let's say you're working with a police force. You might decide that idling is such and such a way that there's a particular max speed. There are legitimate reasons to want to access the CAN bus and work with ECUs. I'm sure, is there anyone in the room that's not familiar with the GPAC? Okay, perfect score. So Chris Valasek and Charlie Miller showed how this could be done remotely. That led to the world's first cybersecurity recall. That was 2015. In 2016, they went back. People had said, well, you can do this remotely, but what if can you do this locally? Can you do this at highway speeds? And they were able to do that. So those are the two biggest demonstrations that we've seen of this. And I think relevantly, if we're looking end to end, it was October 2016 that we saw the largest distributed denial of service attack on the United States. So if your focus is just locking down a piece of a car, yes, you've done that, but the attack surface is end to end. So those telematics systems where you have a cloud back-end infrastructure, and then you have a communications channel to the vehicle, and then you have your vehicle itself. All of that is attackable, and at the end, you can be hacked. You have to cover everything. So today, what have we seen? There are new vulnerabilities. After Valasek and Miller, we saw vulnerabilities with other manufacturers. It's been shown that those vulnerabilities also extend to commercial vehicles, big rigs, trucks, and buses. And one of the biggest audiences for that are basically car thieves. I saw a month ago, there was an interesting Kickstarter campaign. And again, Craig Smith and Mr. Smith and his team, what they put out was a dongle that plugs into the OBD2 port with a set of software, with a set of instructions. And the way they described it in the press was, this is going to make hacking a car exactly like jailbreaking or rooting a smartphone. So what I would say is you get a strong democratization of knowledge, but the car is coming into a realm where you've got maker kind of people, enthusiasts. There's just a lot of people starting to look at this area. Okay, moving to the core of my talk, what are some of the elements that have happened from industry and from the government that move towards a common standard for engineering, cyber insurance, and legal purposes? If you remember Mr. Nader's book at the beginning of the talk, that led to all the physical safety systems that we see in cars. When you sit in a car, all those things you're familiar with. The state of play going into 2015 was there was no mandatory regulation at all. Nothing. Only in the extent that if there's a software issue that affects safety, that can trigger a recall. And that's what we saw with Valasek and Miller. So what has gone on? In 2015, which is my background, DARPA recognized this issue with the military, and they were looking at how do we harden systems from drones that you're all familiar with to medical devices, and also for military vehicles. Is it possible for somebody to know what my location is? Could somebody stop my vehicle? Could somebody turn my vehicle off into the ditch? So we have learnings coming from DARPA, that's a Hackens project. Over near me in DC, in the Virginia State Police in 2015, they realized something that's significant. A lot of people say there's a lot of variety of vehicles on the road. If you consider law enforcement, it's a relatively narrow set of vehicles, and they're all connected. Okay? So there are some learnings there with the state police. Similar projects have occurred with Michigan police and others. And we saw the first moves in Congress. A couple of senators back in 2015 proposed something with the snappy name of the Spy Car Act 2015. Now this didn't become law, but it did raise awareness. They made some interesting proposals which were mandatory, first thing, looking at cybersecurity, looking at privacy, and to my mind, one of the most important things, pen testing. Industry responded, and the Auto ISAC was set up. The idea of an ISAC in general is sharing knowledge. You know, if I'm a hacker and I go to vendor A, and if vendor A keeps it to themselves, that same hacker can use the same playbook to go to vendor B, vendor C, and so on. So the Auto ISAC in the beginning, 2015, was relatively narrow. It was just a few OEMs and tier one. What's happened since then is that they've very much expanded, and now it includes commercial vehicles, trucks, and they've begun to open to industry and people like myself. So I think that's a really, really good move. There were some excellent voluntary standards from SAE in 2016, and the things in red, the FBI with the DOT and NHTSA came out and issued a public service warning that this was a thing. This is a big issue. A little later that year, we had the FTC warning, and this is really around the amount of data that's in a car. If you sync your phone, it's there. And NHTSA, and also you probably don't recognize it, the unusual NMFTA is the trucking industry group, also its own cybersecurity standards. And of course, if you follow it, as we do in DC, there's some interesting testimony around distributed denial of service, because of course you've got a potential vulnerability. The car is almost the poster child of a connected Internet of Things device. And I'll come back to that point. Again, about a month ago, the two senators introduced a new version of their 2015 Act, the 2017 Spy Car Act, which again is about pen testing, cybersecurity, data privacy, and they had an interesting provision which I thought was good, was around communication. There's a separate and bipartisan bill that came up again about a month or two ago, which is the Spy Car Study Act. That's subtly different. That's referring the problem back to the standards people, but with a deadline. So as I move into my wrap-up phase, I'd like to talk about the streetlight effect. Having gone through all the cybersecurity standards, guidelines, even one group had a manifesto. What I saw, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. This is a drunk man. He's lost his keys, and the cop asks, "Why are you looking here? Is this where you lost his keys?" And he said, "No, I didn't lose my keys here, but the light's better." The reason I bring that up, a couple of decades ago, I worked in the nuclear industry, obviously doing software to a very high security standard. And a lot of the standards that I see then are the same as those now. A big emphasis on, if I work now and I'm doing the Model 2020, the Model 2021, and so on, it's a good best practice. It's building security in, but it kind of begs a question. And this is really my take home, the wrap up from this story, the move from hardware to software connectivity and automation. I think we have solid progress in terms of the industry standards that are being developed, in terms of at least awareness and debate on Capitol Hill. But these are my take homes, my 3 points that I believe need a little bit more attention. One thing I see out in the industry, used to be a software developer myself. You've got a Gantt chart, you've got your software development life cycle. Now we're calling it a secure software development life cycle. But those last steps, you've got internal testers, you blue team, if you will. Does the software do what I expect it to do? Those guys report into the same management structure, they've got the same timelines and so on. I would say that that's a necessary step, it's an important step, but there are people out there, and if we look at the breaches we've seen to date, or at least the academic ones, I would say it's very important that every step we leverage pen testers. So pen testers, that's penetration testing. These are white hat hackers, and the whole motivation is, how do I break in? If I maybe make the analogy with the US military, obviously we don't want terrorists or bad guys to break into ships or bases or take control of things, and you have regular soldiers that guard these bases. The Navy, for example, uses Navy SEALs, and their mission is break into this base. And pretty much every time, talking historically, they were able to do that. And the reason is they just have a lot of expertise at getting around security. And that's why I believe pen testing, these are the people with the most expertise and experience to break in. So that's my first point. My second one is, it's great, we've got so much focus on new development and new vehicles, and I understand that, but especially if you look at that most vulnerable group, which is fleets, if we look at some of the economic drivers, that if I'm running a trucking fleet, it's an extremely competitive business. 40% of my cost is fuel, another third of my cost is drivers. The drivers, there's a shortage of drivers in the industry, and then I can't use the truck as much as I would like because I have mandatory downtime. In my opinion, one of the first moves to automation and ADAS in general is going to be trucking. So in general, that we think about OTA, we think about aftermarket, we think about how do we protect vehicles that are on the road today and not just those that are coming in the future. And my third point is really leveraging some of the, not necessarily from automotive, but some of the best practices and and I'm seeing this happening, some of the best practices out there. What happened with aviation? What did we do to secure trains? What were the experiences of the United States DoD and the Hackens project? What did we learn from law enforcement? And this is just the general, as an engineering person. If you think about the CAN bus and you've got 100 ECUs, for example, you're not going to go overnight and go from 100 are unprotected to now 100 are completely hardened. You've got an extremely long supply chain. You've got a lot of players in there. In my opinion, what's going to happen is it's going to change over time. There aren't necessarily a lot of budgets, not necessarily a lot of time, not necessarily a lot of armies of experts. So to embrace some of the technologies that have a capability to mitigate across many components. If I have a bus with 100 components hanging off, is there a way to protect the bus? If I'm distributing code to ECUs, and I'm sure you're all familiar with things like code signing and the like, is there a way to just take existing binaries and harden them? So those are my 3 points, and with that, wrap up my talk.
Questions? I know we have questions for Simon. Any questions? Well, if they don't, I do.
All right.
So my question for you, with coming with my SAE hat on, is what is it going to take to get an educated workforce to help in the area of cybersecurity? Clearly, some universities are doing some work, but I think it's overall looking at not only the industry, but the OEM supplier community on trying to find and locate those specific specialists. So my question is, what in your mind do we have to do as an industry to get a better educated workforce?
I got you. I think one vehicle, just leveraging on top of what I've already seen, is a group like the Auto ISAC is beginning that exercise of disseminating information. If I look back a year or two, honestly, as someone coming from the cybersecurity research, I looked at it as more of an industry and a trade organization that was a little bit too limited. Like the white hat hackers that had found vulnerabilities, they weren't represented. what I've seen is an expansion of that coverage and an embrace of collaboration. I was sitting on an earlier panel with many of the people from UMTRI, from DOT's Volpe, just various people in there. The second point, I believe it's UMTRI, which has, I always forget the name of it, but an open source platform for doing over-the-air updates. So I think it's really more of what's begun. I think if I rephrase this talk, it was a little provocative title, Cyber Unsafe at Any Speed. It was really to raise awareness. It's doing more of what we've already begun. If we look at it in a historical context, the ISACs began in kind of finance and aviation. These are 10, 15, 20 years ago. The industry's gone from being kind of shocked in 2015 to here we are in 2017, and it's beginning.
I believe we have a question in the back.
Yes, Simon, I have a question for you. Your example of Navy SEALs penetrating the Navy base is very good. If we look at that similar example of an automotive expert trying to penetrate one of the surfaces, the first thing that comes to mind is who's going to pay for these people? And but the specific question I'd like to ask is, might there be a role for SAE to be a hat or a club of, say, white hat hackers who for hire could go out and focus on some vehicle? And it might be a question for you or maybe for Mark.
I think that's a good suggestion. Obviously, when you say pen tester, you've got standards like in the payment card industry, PCI. It's actually part of the PCI standard that you be penetration testers, and they have a standard for what constitutes that. I think the SAE would be in a good position to say, hey, these are the 10, 20, 30, whatever groups, you know, across the world that can do that. I think it's an interesting suggestion, because logically, let's say I'm vendor XYZ and I think, oh yeah, I'd love to get some pen testers. Who qualifies? You know, on the one hand, our team that worked on Hackams, or you know, Chris Valasek and Charlie Miller, really good level. At the same time, you don't necessarily want people who are just going to, you know, run some automated tools and tick boxes. So the question of what is the standard for that is really important.
One follow-up on that is, how do you tell if a hacker is a white hat hacker or a black hat hacker, and who does the qualification of what is white and what is black? SAE might be able to help on that.
I think it's a fair question. So the idea of accreditation is important.
Well, Simon, thank you so very much. Everybody, will you be around to after we have Michael is going to present? Then we'll take a break, and if you would be willing to hang around, we'd greatly appreciate it. And there were several other questions that were coming from the room, so please take this opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with you, if you would be so.
Absolutely.
Thank you so very much. Again,